Good afternoon, Deeside Ramblers. A pleasure to be here this afternoon to talk about the Star of Bethlehem. So I'll be reminding people, for those not familiar with the Gospel of St. Matthew, what it is in there about the idea of the Star of Bethlehem and the Magi seeing a star in the east. I'm going to be considering what are the possible astronomical candidates that might be the Star of Bethlehem. There are a number of possibilities. How many are there, and how well do they fit the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew, and hence how many of them could be considered to be candidates for the Star of Bethlehem? We'll have a think about the dates as to when particular things happened in the sky, when comets or planets were at particular places, and we'll ask ourselves, do any of the dates of things that we know did happen, do any of them fit closely with the timeline of the Nativity? Then I'm going to use a little bit of software to show you what the sky actually looked like 2,000 years ago. We can do that because it's very easy to calculate where things are now, how the planets move, how comets move, etc. And it's relatively easy to simply dial back 2,000 years and say what was in the sky 2,000 years ago. And then I'll summarize right at the end there. So let's deal with the account first. The idea of the Magi seeing a star in the east and then journeying to Bethlehem. So the principal elements of Matthew's account, there are 5 things that I'm going to highlight in red, and those are the 5 things that we're going to try and match up to an actual astronomical event. So the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem because they were prompted by the appearance of a star in the east. Bear in mind, they didn't travel east. They saw a star in the east and went west. So what was this star in the east? What might it have been? Remember, the Bible doesn't say they followed the star. The Christmas carol might, but the Bible doesn't say they followed the star. They saw a star in the east. They went west. When they got to Jerusalem, they asked King Herod, what's this we see about something in the sky telling us about a birth of the King of the Jews? They asked Herod about that. So you can ask yourself, question 1, why did they interpret the Star of Bethlehem as being a sign that there was going to be a birth of the King of the Jews? And having asked Herod that, why did he say, what are you talking about? I'm not aware of any such prophecy, any such astrological significance in the sky. So there must be a reason, presumably, why Herod was not aware of this particular sign. The Magi journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky. So if a star appears in the east, we've got to find an explanation for why it might reappear in a different part of the sky. And finally, it stopped over Bethlehem. So those 5 things in red are the 5 things that are going to try and explain, or at least find a candidate that matches up with as many of those factors as possible. But before we do that, let's just remind ourselves about the lyrics in the Christmas carol. Sing along if you like. That's enough of that. We 3 kings of Orient are. That's how the Christmas carol goes. But I'm a scientist. I like precision. I like accuracy. So when we look at the lyrics of We 3 Kings, we ask ourselves, well, why do we sing about 3 magi or 3 kings coming to see the baby Jesus? The Bible doesn't say there were 3 of them. The Bible just says there were 3 gifts presented: gold, Frankenstein, and myrrh. If there were 3 gifts, it simply assumed that there were 3 people, 3 magi. It might have been there were actually 20, of whom 3 brought gifts, and the other 17 were saying, I didn't know we were supposed to bring gifts. So we really shouldn't have three in the title of We Three Kings. We shouldn't have that because we don't actually know there were three of them. So let's take that out. Kings. Where do you get kings from? There's no mention of kings in the Bible. It talks about three magi, the plural of magus. And as it happens, that means gender male. So it means essentially wise men. But where do you get kings from? No mention of kings in the Bible. So we really shouldn't have that word in there either. Where did the magi come from? Well, the Bible doesn't say. They might have come from Persia. They might have come from India. They might have come from Outer Mongolia. They might have come from the Orient. But the Bible doesn't actually specify. So we really can't say where they came from either. And the indication is they saw a star in the east and then they went west. So to say that they followed the star is a little bit of a stretch. So we ought to take that out as well. So you can see this Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces. So if we are not going to say we three kings of Orient are, if we're going to be more accurate about it, what should we say? Well, a physicist would say we get rid of three kings in Orient and we replace it with we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are, and we saw a star. Now, it doesn't meter quite as well as the original We Three Kings, which is why physicists don't write Christmas carols. And remember, we should not talk about three kings. We should not talk about three magi. We should not talk about three wise men, because the three is just an invented number. We really ought to talk about the n wise men, where n is a number between 1 and infinity. It's more than one because the magi is plural, and it's less than infinity. Well, technically it's less than the number of people on the planet, but it's somewhere in there. But it's not necessarily three. Okay, let's have a think about what this star could be. Remember that star doesn't mean star in the sense that we understand today. So we know that we live in a solar system which contains the sun and planets, and there are much more distant stars in the sky. But we must remember that centuries and indeed millennia ago, the word star was simply used to mean something seen in the night sky, other than, for instance, the more familiar moon. So it doesn't mean an object as we understand a star in current terminology. Remember that 2,000 years ago, people would have looked into the night sky and they would have seen fixed patterns of stars in constellations. So yes, the stars appear to move because of the rotation of the Earth, but they all move in concert. So constellations would appear to be fixed in a particular pattern in the sky. But every once in a while, they would see a dot of light that doesn't seem to be one of the fixed stars, as they're often known, but they would be wandering through the sky. And so, for instance, wandering star, not the Lee Marvin version in Paint Your Wagon, but wandering stars have now become planets. That's what we call them. We know about the planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc., all going around the sun. But at the time, they were simply points of light which appeared to move relative to the other constellations in the sky. So we call them planets, but other people have called them wandering stars. And some stars are not just points of light, some stars appear to have tails. So broom stars, or occasionally hairy stars, stars that seem to have tails. We now call them comets, and we know what they are. They are icy bodies, and as the ice evaporates, it can produce tails, sometimes spectacular, sometimes less so. But a hairy star or a broom star is what we now call a comet. And we're all used to the idea of a shooting star. Again, we more likely call them meteors and meteor showers, but again, they are occasionally called shooting stars. So remember, when we say star, it could in principle be a star or a planet or a meteor or a comet or something else. A star in this context simply means something seen in the night sky, other than the obvious moon, which is never referred to as a star. Do we get any clues by looking at art? For instance, this, of course, all artwork will be centuries after the birth of Christ, but do we get any signs of what the Star of Bethlehem might have been? Bear in mind, all depictions in art of the adoration of the Magi will always show three Magi, and will usually dress them up like kings, just like the Christmas Carol. But that's just because the artists think that's what the audience want to see. So here we have a bit of artistry in which presumably that at the top there is the Star of Bethlehem, shining the radiance down onto the baby Jesus. Botticelli, 1475, it's thought that that person is Botticelli, photobombing his own piece of artwork there. And again, we have the adoration of the Magi, apparently three kings. There's Joseph at the back looking thoroughly bored, taking no part whatsoever in the celebration. Perhaps that's appropriate because allegedly he took no part in the conception either. And we look at other pieces of art, and again, sometimes we see a Star of Bethlehem. Giotto is one of the few artists that actually depicted the Star of Bethlehem as what is clearly a comet with a tail like that shooting off into the night sky. Most people treat the star as a star. Giotto was one of the few that depicted it as a comet. That doesn't mean what it was, but it's an interesting idea. And this was back in 1305. Again, lots of other people have depicted the adoration of the Magi. Rubens here, one of the few artists that doesn't appear to show the Star of Bethlehem in the sky. And to make up for it, he puts a double-headed camel in the background there instead. So yes, generally a point of light, sometimes shining down onto Jesus. It doesn't really tell us anything about what the Star of Bethlehem might actually have been. No great surprise, because art is simply showing people what they expect to see. So let's think about what significance a star in the sky might have been, how people might have interpreted the appearance of something in the night sky back then, the astrological significance. These days we think of astronomical events, but remember 2,000 years ago it was just important to think about the astrological significance that might have been associated with a particular object in the sky. Every planet, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation, the constellation that the sun and the planets move through during the course of a year or many years, all of those would have a particular astrological significance. Sometimes the astrological significance would be different between cultures, but there is some overlap between different cultures and how they interpret what's going on in the night sky. So for instance, one of the brightest, or basically the brightest planet in the sky is the planet Venus, Roman god Venus or the Greek god Aphrodite. Of course, every culture will have their own name for this particular planet, but because it's so bright in its appearance in the evening or the morning sky, it was often associated with birth or rebirth, or in the case of the Roman gods and the Greek gods, it was associated with beauty and fertility. So Venus was the mother, if you like, giving birth to new life. Jupiter is, we now know, the largest of the planets, but for centuries and millennia, it's been one of the brightest planets in the sky, and Jupiter has often been associated with the king of planets. Again, the Roman god Jupiter or the Greek god Zeus. And so Jupiter associated with royalty and often called the king of planets. Regulus is a star in the constellation of Leo, and you can perhaps get an idea from the name there, starting REG. It's often called the King of Stars. So it's a bright star in the constellation of Leo. And Leo itself is a constellation with a pattern of stars that's often depicted as that looks a little bit like a lion. Different cultures have said the same thing. And therefore, astrologically speaking, seeing anything happen in the constellation of Leo makes people think of, well, what on earth is associated with a divine Leo in the sky? Well, the people of Judea and the land of Judea are symbolized by a lion, either on their flag or on their documents, whatever, or chiseled into a piece of rock. So Leo in the sky is interpreted as a lion, and the lion is associated with the land of Judea. So there are connections between what planets mean, what constellations mean, and what individual stars mean. Why do astrologers look at the sky and interpret what's in the sky? Because they believe this is essentially the word of God. God is giving us a heads up. If we want to know whether or not the harvest is going to be good, if we want to know whether there's going to be a flood or a famine, if we want to know if anything is going to happen in the near future, it will be written in the stars. literally written in the stars, in the sense that if you know how to interpret what's happening into the sky, you will then understand what God has in store for you over the next months or year or so. In other words, you can think of the sky as basically being God's Facebook page. That's where he posts anything important that mankind ought to be reading. That's why astrologers are important. They're looking at what God has in store for us. So what possible candidates could there be that we might interpret as the Star of Bethlehem? And then we can start thinking about whether it matches up to the 5 highlighted in red bits of the Gospel of St. Matthew that we're trying to explain. So we're going to think of a few possibilities and then ask, does it explain those 5 points? Could it have been interpreted as a star in the east? Would it have been significant? Is there a reason Herod wasn't aware of said appearance of a star? And is it possible that this star would reappear in the sky and then stop in the sky? So let's think about whether or not these candidates meet those criteria. Firstly, could the Star of Bethlehem been a shooting star? Well, meteors and meteor showers occur all the time. There are many meteor showers during the year, maybe a dozen or so bright showers and a few lesser showers as well. So you go out on essentially any night, you're likely to see a shooting star after 2 or 3 or 5 minutes or so. So meteors are by no means uncommon, and they wouldn't have been 2,000 years ago. So could it have been a star in the east? Well, meteors can appear essentially anywhere, and a meteor shower involves meteors all over the sky. So if you did see a spectacular meteor shower, why would you describe it as a star in the east? Is it significant? Well, it happens all the time. So no, the appearance of a meteor shower would not be significant. So even though it's possible meteors might reappear in the sky because there are different meteor showers throughout the year, it clearly doesn't meet all 5 criteria to be the Star of Bethlehem. What about an appearance of a comet in the sky? Well, comets they do appear every once in a while. Very bright comets don't appear that often. So yes, comets can appear in the east. Comets can effectively come from anywhere. So it is possible that the appearance of a bright comet might have been seen in the east. And would it have been significant? Well, if it was bright enough, you would expect the appearance of a comet to be significant to an astrologer. If it was bright enough to be significant, why wasn't Herod aware of it? Surely an appearance of a bright object in the sky, Herod would know that something interesting was about to happen. Well, actually, Herod's eyesight wasn't good, but he had a whole court full of astrologers whose job it was to check the sky and then tell Herod if anything interesting is happening. Could it reappear in the sky? Well, comets go around the sun, and when they go behind the sun, they can temporarily disappear from our view and then reappear a little bit later. So yes, a comet can appear in the sky, apparently disappear, and then reappear in another part of the sky again. So that can happen. Can a comet stop in the sky? Generally speaking, comets just go around the sun. So the idea of a comet moving through the sky and then stopping, it's not altogether clear how that might happen. Not impossible, but I put that down as an X rather than a tick. Comets don't seem to tick all of the boxes as far as the Gospel of St. Matthew. Some people say it's close enough that the Star of Bethlehem could be a comet, but, well, okay, maybe not. What about a nova, a new star? A nova isn't technically a new star. It's the appearance of something that you weren't aware of. A star that is initially quite faint and easy to miss, possibly below the threshold for naked eye visibility. And then every once in a while, a nova will flare up and become a lot brighter and then maybe visible. So it is possible that a nova appeared in the sky sometime around the birth of Christ. Could it appear in the east? Well, yes. Nova can appear essentially anywhere in the sky, so yes. Would it have been significant? Well, if it was bright enough to be easily visible to the naked eye, then that could be considered a significant new star in the sky. But if it was bright enough to be significant, again, that question, why wasn't Herod aware of the fact that this star had appeared? Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, nova a temporary brightening of a star tends to be quite quick, and then the star will fade away over days or weeks or months. And it is possible that that star then brightens again. But generally, that's more likely to be centuries later rather than simply a few months later. So it doesn't seem likely that a nova will brighten and then brighten again a few months later to account for the fact that the star reappeared in the sky. And what about this? The star stopped in the sky. If this is a star, then it moves with all the other stars. It would be in the same fixed position night after night after night. So why would you describe this star as stopping in the sky if it's the same as all other fixed stars and fixed relative to the constellations? So that doesn't seem to make sense either. The same is true if we say, well, what about a supernova? It's a different astrophysical origin, but it's still a star that gets very bright. If it's fairly close to us, it could be very bright in the night sky. So yes, it could appear in the east. It would be significant, but why wouldn't Herod be aware of a very bright object in the sky? And again, this idea of reappearing, well, for a supernova, that's generally speaking a star that's blown itself to pieces at the end of its life. Once a star has done that, it doesn't do it a second time in general. So yes, a supernova might be bright, but it wouldn't reappear in the sky. And again, if it's a star in the traditional sense, why would you describe a star as stopping in the sky? Because it's not moving relative to all the other stars. So none of those seem to quite match what we want from the Gospel of St. Matthew. And I've left gap here at the bottom, so you can probably guess one of the best candidates is thought to be something else. And the something else that a lot of people believe was the Star of Bethlehem is a conjunction of planets. A conjunction means the planets move through the sky. They go through the zodiac constellations at different speeds, depending on whether they are close to the sun or a long way from the sun. And every once in a while, planets pass each other in the sky. They don't normally overlap. They usually miss each other by a degree or two. In other words, you can usually put your thumb between them if you hold it up at arm's length. They pass each other in the sky, but they do end up in the same part of sky every once in a while. Is it possible that two bright planets happen to come close together in a particular part of the sky? Could that happen in the east? Yes, it could. It happens all the time, all over the place. Would it have been significant? Well, it depends on which planets you're talking about, and whether you're an astrologer, you will then attach a particular significance to this planet and the constellation in which they come into conjunction. So yes, it is possible that it could be considered significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of this particular Star of Bethlehem? Well, maybe his astrologers were aware of the fact that two planets came together, but maybe those astrologers didn't come to the same interpretation as, well, it looks like we're going to have a new king of the Jews. So it is possible that Herod wasn't aware of what they were talking about. Can a conjunction reappear in the sky? Yes, it can. You can have planets come together, and then some months later, you can have those two planets come together again. So if that was the Star of Bethlehem, yes, it could reappear in the sky. And finally, can you describe a planet as stopping in the sky? Yes, for a reason that I'm going to come to in just a moment. Although planets spend most of their time going around the sun and apparently moving from west to east across the sky, every once in a while, some planets will appear to stop in the sky and then go backwards and stop and then go forwards. Let's see why that is possible. But notice that there's a possibility that conjunctions of planets could explain all of the aspects of the Star of Bethlehem. So let's deal with this business of how planets move around the sun. Here's a couple of hypothetical planets moving around the sun. The rule of gravitational interaction is the closer you are to the sun, the stronger the pull of gravity, the faster the planet moves. So if we imagine this is, for instance, Earth and Mars, for the sake of argument, Earth is closer to the sun than Mars, so the Earth goes around the sun faster. It's not simply the fact that its racetrack is shorter because it's closer to the sun. It actually moves faster in terms of how many miles an hour it's moving. So you can see that the inner planet will go around the sun in a lot shorter time than an outer planet. That's just the rule of how planets move. In fact, it's the rule of how all objects move when you're in an orbit around an object. How does this apply to looking at some of the planets in the solar system? Well, if we imagine that the green planet is us here on planet Earth, and the red planet is one of the outer planets, that would mean Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc. Then, because Earth is moving faster than this outer planet, what happens when you're driving down the motorway and all the cars are moving in the same direction? But if you overtake a car, that car can, from your perspective, appear to be moving backwards because you're moving faster than it. So although the planets will generally move from west to east, if every once in a while the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane, as we overtake that planet, the planet will appear to move backwards in the sky. So if we were to trace out how the planet is moving in the sky, it seems to do this, as indicated on the right-hand side. The planet moves from west to east, but when the Earth overtakes it, it stops in the sky, moves backwards, stops again, and then continues moving forwards. So that's simply the appearance. The planets are all going in the same direction, but the appearance on the sky, if we overtake a planet on the inside lane, is such that it appears the planet moves west to east, stops, moves backwards for perhaps a few weeks or months, and then stops again and then continues on its travel. So this S shape is something we see. We can plot out the position of Mars or Jupiter or Saturn in the sky night after night, and we see that they do this every once in a while. They appear to go backwards because the Earth overtakes it on the inside track. So it's called retrograde motion, but we don't have to worry about that. All that matters is Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, not the inner planets, but the outer planets appear to do that. Okay, now we understand that, we can start to think about what's happening in terms of timing. We have a few candidates of what might be the Star of Bethlehem. It looks like the conjunction is the front runner, but let's just double check if anything else was around at the time. The timeline here is a few years before, well, let's call it BC. It's the standard before Christ, but we don't actually know when Christ was born. One thing to bear in mind is there's no year zero. If you count backwards, 3 AD, 2 AD, 1 AD, if you go backwards, you don't get to 0 AD. There is no year zero. You go straight from 1 AD to 1 BC. Just a warning in case you ever look at a book or a magazine article or an app on your phone that says this is what the sky looked like. Bear in mind that when you're looking 2,000 years ago, there was no year zero. So when was Christ born? Well, we don't know, but some people think Christ was born somewhere in that block there. 6 BC is quite a popular guesstimate of where Christ might have been born, but we have an uncertainty of at least a few years in either direction. Some scholars believe that it wasn't after 4 BC because Christ was born when Herod was alive. But do we know when Herod died? Well, you don't find a document that says King Herod died in 4 BC. If you find that document, you know it's false. So the death of King Herod is not something that's written down with a particular date. It's written down by referencing other phenomena. King Herod died this many weeks after the lunar eclipse, which followed the really bad famine because of the previous flood or whatever. A whole load of events occurred, and those events are used to date other events. Some people believe that the death of King Herod in 4 BC was based on the fact that he died after an eclipse of the moon. Other scholars believe, but you've got the wrong eclipse. An eclipse occurred here and an eclipse occurred there. So maybe he didn't die in 4 BC, maybe he died in, I think it was either 2 or 1 BC. So the reason for Christ's birth being sometime up to 4 gets a little more flexible if we say, well, we're not actually sure when King Herod died. And some people believe that Christ might have been born 3 BC or 2 BC or somewhere in that sort of area. I'm still not sure why people don't believe it's anywhere in the gap. I would say, well, surely there's enough uncertainty that it might be anywhere from 1 BC up to 8 BC or thereabouts. So we cannot be sure about any of this. What we can be sure of is the astronomical calculation of, for instance, there was a comet in the sky in 12 BC. We know that. That's not subject to debate. That's something we can calculate. And we are fairly sure that this comet, which is Halley's Comet, the one you've heard of, that was in the sky in 12 BC. Halley's Comet is quite a bright comet. We've seen it come round quite a few times in modern times. If Halley's Comet was in the sky in 12 BC, it probably would have been quite bright. It probably would have caught the attention of the astrologers. But why would God be posting stuff on his Facebook page in 12 BC if Christ wasn't going to be born for quite a few more years yet? Seems a bit early to be posting stuff. There are other comets in 5 and 4 BC. That first comet is Comet Holmes. If you're not astronomers, you're probably not familiar with that. That's a comet that came round fairly recently and was photographed by a lot of amateur astronomers. That was almost certainly around in 5 BC, but it would not have been very bright. So even if it was there, even if it was in the sky, astrologers would have easily missed it. And the other comet is called 67P. Almost certainly that would not have been visible to the naked eye. And remember, no telescopes back in these days. So bright, but rather early, about the right time, but rather faint. So comets don't seem to quite fit the bill. There were nova around. We have historical documents from the Chinese and from the Koreans that say a new star appeared in the sky around about 5 BC, according to the Chinese, and around about 4 BC, according to the Koreans. Now, bright nova don't tend to come around that often. You're lucky if you get a bright nova every 100 years or so. So what's the chances that 2 came along within a few months of each other at that particular point, as documented by 2 different cultures? Well, it's thought that the most likely thing is somebody's got their dates slightly wrong by a few months. And in fact, late 5 BC or early 4 BC, they probably saw the same nova. And it's just been recorded slightly differently by the 2 different cultures. So yes, there was a nova at about the right time. But for the reasons we've been through in the last slide, nova don't fit the bill. Nova will be fixed relative to the other stars. So how do you account for the fact that it reappeared in the sky some months later or a year later? And why would you describe it as stopping in the sky? So then we come to, well, could it have been a conjunction of planets? And here I'm switching to astrological symbols just to make life a little easier. That first symbol means conjunction. The dumbbell means the 2 planets appearing in the same part of the sky. And these symbols here are Jupiter and Saturn. There's the little key down there. That thing that looks a little bit like a 4 is Jupiter. The thing that looks like an H is Saturn. And you're familiar with the symbol for the female gender there. That's Venus. So there was a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter at about 6 BC. And some people say that is the most likely candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. That is indeed a possibility. But I think the other one, the fact that Jupiter was in conjunction with Venus a few years later, I think that is a much more interesting conjunction. I'm not saying it is necessarily the Star of Bethlehem, and of course it only works if King Herod's death is a few years later than some people believe. But I think it's worth having a quick gander at this one because of its possible interpretation. So let's have a look at the sky. This is the sky visible 2,000 years ago. I'm sure you can't read this, but I've set this particular piece of software to show me the sky in August of 3 BC. And remember, we know where the stars are, we know how the planets are moving, and we can work out where the planets are now, and we can simply wind the clock back to any previous historical event. 2,000 years is not a problem. 2 million years isn't really a problem. If we wanted to dial it back further than that, well, the accuracy is a bit iffy. But to within a second or 2 or a few minutes, we know where things were in the sky 2,000 years ago. So I've labeled The planet Jupiter, here is the constellation of Leo, looking a little bit like a lion's mane there, this backwards question mark. I've labeled Jupiter, I haven't labeled anything else, otherwise the labels get really confusing. And in this particular software, we're just looking at a patch of sky. I'm not going to show you the sun rising and the sun setting, and I'm not going to show you what the horizon is doing because things change during the year. I'm just going to fix the gaze on what's happening in the region of the constellation of Leo. So there's Jupiter, and that bright spot to the right of it is Venus. And remember, the inner planets closer to the sun move faster than the outer planets. So all the planets are initially going to go from west to east. So that means from the right-hand side to the left-hand side, the zodiac, there's Gemini, there's Cancer, there's Leo, there's Virgo. So the zodiac is running through here, and all the planets are moving, roughly speaking, from right to left. So if I run this simulation and start the clock going, we see what happens to Jupiter and Venus. Venus and Jupiter get very close in the sky. They might be separated by perhaps one thumb's width, but Venus is a very bright object, Jupiter is a very bright object. So the two brightest objects in the night sky, other than the moon, have now come into very close proximity to each other. So what might an astrologer make of that? Venus and Jupiter are in conjunction, and that has happened in the constellation of Leo. Venus, Jupiter, Leo. Birth, king, land of Judea. Birth of the king of the Jews. An astrologer might interpret that conjunction in that constellation as something interesting is about to happen, and it's related to a birth of the king of the Jews. It is definitely worth keeping an eye on the sky to see what happens next, they might say to themselves. Let's run the simulation forward and see what happens. Venus continues to move through the sky and comes off to the left-hand side there and zooms off to the left. What happens to Jupiter? It goes right next door to the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. That bright star is Regulus, the king of stars. So the king of planets has just passed the king of stars. And what happens to Jupiter? Remember what happens when the Earth is on the inside track? Jupiter stops in the sky and appears now to move backwards for a while, for a few months. So it's not actually stopping, it's just an appearance because of the movement of the Earth. So Jupiter now passes Regulus a second time. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars for a second time. And Jupiter is going backwards, but eventually Jupiter stops. The video is still running, and Jupiter will then continue to move forward again. And Jupiter will pass Regulus a third time. So the king of planets has passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times over a period of a few months. It's as if the kings are doing a little dance. It's as if the kings, maybe one king is going to be handing over to a new king. We've just seen this sign of there's going to be a birth of the king of the Jews. And now it looks like one king is going to pass over to another king. Maybe King Herod ought to be aware of this because it sounds like there's a new kid on the block who's about to come along. This is now in early 2 BC. The astrologers are now getting excited. There's something going on here. Birth of the king of the Jews. Kings are handing over to kings. Let's keep an eye on the sky and see what happens next. They keep an eye on the sky, and Venus comes back again. There's Venus, and Venus comes into conjunction with Jupiter again. Venus, Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Birth of the king of the Jews is stamped a second time in the sky a few months after they first saw it. How close are they this time? Well, originally they might have passed within a thumb's width of each other, still easily seen as 2 bright points in the sky. But this time they are really, really, really close. So close, no human would be able to resolve them as 2 points of light. These 2 planets would come together and would be indistinguishable and would give you a very bright point in the sky. We now have telescopes, so we could, if we wish, zoom into that to see, well, just how close are these 2 planets in the sky? They, of course, have to rely on their naked eye, but if we had a telescope, we'd be able to zoom in and say, wow, that is how close they appeared to get. From our line of sight, Jupiter and Venus would be so close together, the resolution of the human eye would not be able to separate those two. Anything separated by more than 2 or 3 meters on this particular scale would not be separated as 2 points of light. This would appear as a very, very bright point of light in the sky. And this conjunction, a conjunction this close of 2 bright planets, doesn't happen very often. A few times every millennium, perhaps. So it's a fairly safe bet that the astrologers would never have seen anything quite like this before. So maybe they considered this to be the starting pistol, telling them that they ought to go and have a look at what was going on. 3 BC, just a reminder, there was a conjunction of Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo, birth of the King of the Jews. This particular conjunction would have been seen shortly before sunrise in the constellation of Leo. So this particular star in August of 3 BC would have been birth of the King of the Jews, and that would have appeared in the sky in the east just before sunrise. So a star in the east. If they continued to watch the sky, they would have seen Jupiter pass Regulus, not once, not twice, but 3 times, a so-called triple conjunction. Maybe this dance between the 2 kings, the king of stars and the king of planets, could be interpreted as a crown is being handed over from one king to another. So we better go and talk to Herod about what's going on here. The conjunction occurred again, Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo, again birth King Jew. This time the conjunction being so close, it wasn't simply 2 points of light getting close and then separating again. It was 2 points of light merging into one even brighter point of light, something that they wouldn't have seen before. So maybe they decided at that point that it's worth going to see Herod and finding out what's going on. How long would it have taken them from that point to actually arrive in Jerusalem? We have no way of telling because we don't know where they came from. Persia, India, Mongolia. And were they walking or did they have camels? You look at a Christmas card, they always have camels, but that doesn't tell us that they actually didn't walk. So we've got no idea how long it would have taken them to get to Jerusalem or Bethlehem. It's interesting to note, it's sort of interesting to note, that if it actually took them quite a few months to get there, they might have arrived later in the year of 2 BC. And in the December of 2 BC, well, Jupiter does actually stop in the sky during that month. Remember, it stops in the sky every once in a while when the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane. It just so happened that, yes, Jupiter does stop in the sky during the month of December, some months after this fantastic conjunction of the 2 planets. Which particular day in December does Jupiter stop in the sky in 2 BC? Well, it happens to be the 25th of December, but that is a pure coincidence because we know that Christmas Day in the Christian calendar was simply taking over an old pagan festival of Saturnalia. So there's no particular significance to the 25th of December. It's just interesting to note that that planet did stop in the sky at the end of 2 BC. So these events we know took place. What we don't know is, did the astrologers interpret these events in the way I've described? We've simply speculated that we know these things happened. We know these things would have appeared in the sky. What would they have done when they've seen these particular events? They might have interpreted it in the way that I've indicated in the black. We know these things happened in the red, but whether or not they saw it as this is a sign, we need to go to Jerusalem, we need to pay homage to the new birth of the King of the Jews, who knows? So maybe it was the conjunctions I've described that were the Star of Bethlehem. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a combination of those. Maybe it was actually the appearance of a comet as well as a planetary conjunction. Determining the facts is easy. That's just science. Science is always easy. We know what actually happened, but we can only second guess the significance of what astrologers would have attached to those known events that appeared in the sky. So maybe these conjunctions did occur. Maybe they were fantastic. Maybe they were noted, not necessarily written down anywhere, but maybe stories of these conjunctions were passed down through the generations and somehow ended up getting woven into the narrative of the Gospels when it was describing the birth of Christ. So it's possible that a real event got woven into the Gospels, of course, written many, many decades after the actual event themselves. So there are facts and there is speculation. But regardless of whether or not you believe that this conjunction was the Star of Bethlehem or not, you could say, well, it doesn't really matter because the underlying message is still the same. I know it's still November, but may I wish you a very Merry Christmas. Thank you all very much.